Hey, welcome back. So for this video, we're going to be talking about the program that you're going to be using for your next project, which is Adobe Illustrator. So hopefully you've already watched this little video. It's a very quick, but I think a pretty good synopsis of what Adobe Illustrator can do. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to talk about the difference between Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop. So these are just two of quite a few programs that you'll find in the Adobe Creative Cloud that the districts actually paid for the entire cloud for all of us, which is awesome. But you might already realize that these are fairly complicated if you're not familiar with them. Not always user-friendly when you're first getting started, but the cool thing is as soon as you start to understand them, especially even if you just start to understand one, then a lot of times the interfaces look very similar and you can start popping in and out of all of them. So it can be incredibly helpful. I know before I started teaching graphic design, I spoke to quite a few different graphic designers, and I always asked, what programs do you use or what are your absolute favorites? And Photoshop and Illustrator were the number ones that always came up. InDesign is also an Adobe product. That one comes up as well for more of paper products, but usually just supplementing these two. And oftentimes graphic designers will work back and forth for these because one of them is better at some things and the other one is better at other things. And so you can easily pop in and out of both of them though, which makes it really nice. But there are some very significant differences, and so I want to talk about why we're going to use Adobe Illustrator for this next project. So here are the main differences between Photoshop and Illustrator. First thing you need to understand is that Photoshop is creating what's called pixel graphics, whereas Adobe Illustrator is creating vector graphics. This is the number one difference between the two of them. So if it's a pixel graphic, as you can see on my screen, this like popsicle is very pixelated, and so you can see the individual boxes, and as you take this, if you blew it up, you would just continue to see individual boxes. So the way that this saves, if I wanted to create a pixel graphic in Photoshop, it'd be very easy just to draw something up. But then as I save it, it actually saves every individual pixel, which is why with Photoshop, it saves a lot slower and it takes a lot more memory and a lot more space on your computer. Illustrator works in a different way. So Illustrator uses vectors and it actually uses little points all along your image. It's trickier to create. You can't just draw a vector and have it be done. You have to use certain tools to create it. And basically you're creating these different shapes and you're putting these shapes together. But because they're shapes and not individual pixels, when you blow it up, you keep the clear image, which is the number one reason why Illustrator is so beneficial. If you see any billboards or any giant graphics, it has to be vector to be able to blow up that large. So the cool thing is you can take photos, usually more like clip art things from Photoshop and throw them in Illustrator. And by the end of this project, you'll know how to take some of those things and transform them into vectors so that you could blow them up and play with them. And then you can also, the same way, although I'm not sure why you would, but you could take like a vector graphic and throw it into Photoshop and create pixels. Maybe you want to do that so you can draw all over it. I don't know. So those are the main differences. And because they work in those different ways, Photoshop is best for photo editing. It has all those different photo editing features. It's great for painting or drawing digitally. So if you're just an artist trying to create something really creative like that, then Photoshop is going to be your number one place. Whereas if you're more of a graphic designer, you're focusing on logos or branding or anything that you might have to then replicate over and over again for different products, you are going to want to use Illustrator. Because as you can imagine, if you're replicating something, like if I designed the Spotify logo, I potentially might need that on something giant. I'm going to need to be able to pull it and change it very quickly. Whereas Photoshop, if you want to change something, it's a little bit more complicated. So those are the major differences between the two. Here's some images, and here's where you can actually see on Illustrator, it has these individual points. And so that's how it's created. So as you can imagine, with this one on the left from Photoshop, if I were to zoom in, it'd be each individual box that your computer then has to remember. Whereas with Illustrator, instead of having 100 little boxes in this area, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 little points, and how they're connected pathways to connect them. And that's all it has to remember. So you can imagine like 100 and something versus 10. It's going to be a lot faster. Now, I can just draw over any pixel and I can easily manipulate it, whereas in Illustrator, I have to create these individual pathways. But we will practice that. I'll show you some basics on how to do that. And it's pretty cool once you learn how to do it and how it works. Really quick, I want you to be familiar with the Illustrator workspace. It's somewhat similar to Photoshop. So you have your main Windows bar, your menu bar up top where you can find all the good stuff. This is where window is. I think this is one of the #1 places where people need. They drop the window down if they want to get into like layers, or if really there's anything in particular you need and you don't see on your workspace, click on window and you're gonna find it. This is your main artboard. So this is where you're going to be working. You can work outside of the artboard when you're in Illustrator. Here's where all your good tools are. And if you right click on the tools, you get more versions of those same tools, which is pretty sweet. Here's where the colors are. So you have your fill, which is in the front, and then you have your stroke in the back, which is basically just an outline. Your main status bar, so like how zoomed in and things. And then just kind of a floating palette that will pull out. Make sure you're in essentials as you're working, because that's how I'm going to show you how to use it. And then when you're clicked on any of the tools, you get this like little control panel up here. We also call it the options bar. And so if I'm clicked on, this looks like if I'm just clicked on a like pen tool or something, these are the options for the pen tool. And so this changes as you change what tools you're on. And then there's some just major shortcuts that as you work more and more, you're going to get really used to. The pin tool is just P. Direct selection is if you're trying to directly select just like one pathway. That's going to be A. If you want to rotate something quickly, you can do R. Type out something, use the text tool, you can do T. Shape builder, artboard, so there's lots of different things on here. And then the #1 things I use is just like copy and paste, and zoom in is just Control plus, zoom out is Control minus. And then if I want to undo, I can just Control Z. So that's probably the #1 that I use for this. So hopefully this gives you a little more understanding of what Adobe Illustrator is, because now you're going to be jumping in, you're going to be actually doing some little exercises with it, just to kind of get you warmed up and familiar with it. And then we will jump into your project.